This is your brain on risk. This is Mind Over Money, the podcast where Kevin Cook exposes the psychology of investing.
Welcome back to Mind Over Money. I'm Kevin Cook, your field guide and storyteller for the fascinating arena of behavioral economics. Did you read the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig? Great book I read many, many years ago. I just gave it to my son recently for his 22nd birthday because I think every young person should read it. It's the subtitle is An Inquiry into Values because it's written by someone who's very philosophical, went on a tour of the country on his motorcycle with his son, and just he ties in a lot of cool concepts with the motorcycle and his repair of it as a metaphor or maybe analogies. But one thing that Pirsig introduced us to was a phrase that you don't hear anymore unless you live in New York by this lake, and the word is Chautauqua. Chautauqua is an Iroquois word with a few meanings. It could mean a bag tied in the middle or two moccasins tied together. It also describes the shape of Chautauqua Lake located in southwest New York. And this area was the setting for the first educational assembly. I guess it was called the Chautauqua Institution. But it gave rise to a movement that occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm going to read from Pirsig here and let him describe what a Chautauqua is and what he's trying to accomplish by having one with you. What is in mind is a sort of Chautauqua. That's the only name I can think of for it, like the traveling tent show Chautauquas that used to move across America. This America, the one that we are in now, an old-time series of popular talks intended to edify and entertain, improve the mind, and bring culture and enlightenment to the ears and thoughts of the hearer. The Chautauquas were pushed aside by faster-paced radio, movies, and TV. And it seems to me the change was not entirely an improvement. Perhaps because of these changes, the stream of national consciousness moves faster now and is broader, but it seems to run less deep. The old channels cannot contain it, and in its search for new ones, there seems to be growing havoc and destruction along its banks. In this Chautauqua, I would like not to cut any new channels of consciousness, but simply dig deeper into old ones that have become silted in with the debris of thoughts grown stale and platitudes too often repeated. And Pirsig continues here. What's new is an interesting and broadening eternal question, but one which, if pursued exclusively, results only in an endless parade of trivia and fashion, the silt of tomorrow. I would like instead to be concerned with the question, what is best? A question which cuts deeply rather than broadly, a question whose answers tend to move the silt downstream. There are eras of human history in which the channels of thought have been too deeply cut, and no change was possible, and nothing new ever happened, and best was a matter of dogma. But that is not the situation now. Now the stream of our common consciousness seems to be obliterating its own banks, losing its central direction and purpose, flooding the lowlands, disconnecting and isolating the highlands, and to no particular purpose, other than the wasteful fulfillment of its own internal momentum. Some channel deepening seems called for. Given this introduction, let me begin my Chautauqua today. Now, the way I do them is to connect ideas by connecting books. I've done that in many podcasts. This one might bring in the most. I will likely talk about at least 6 books and articles. And if I do this right, you will see their connections and several important themes in the cerebral web I hope to weave. I will also make a note whenever we come across a topic I have explored on a previous podcast. The article version of this podcast will have a link to the Mind Over Money podcast archive, as well as links to individual episodes. The first book I will introduce you to was written over 60 years ago by a grandson of Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. And if you don't know who Thomas Henry Huxley was, Darwin was, when he was asked to speak or discuss his theory of evolution and natural selection, he wasn't quite as bold and maybe appropriately so, because the idea was not well received. And so he was not a vigorous proponent of his own ideas, but Thomas Henry Huxley was, and he was willing to debate just about anybody on them. So his grandson, Sir Julian Huxley, was born in 1887 and left us in 1975. He was a British evolutionary biologist and a vigorous proponent himself of natural selection, just like his granddad. He was considered a leading figure in the mid-20th century modern synthesis. The modern synthesis in biology and evolution was the early 20th century synthesis reconciling Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and Gregor Mendel's ideas on heredity in a joint mathematical framework. Huxley coined the term in his 1942 book, Evolution, the Modern Synthesis. Now, Julian was not only the older brother of Aldous Huxley, he was the first director of UNESCO, a founding member of the World Wildlife Fund, and the first president of the British Humanist Association. There is also some controversy surrounding his view on eugenics, which I am not familiar with. For my podcast on the work of Aldous Huxley and his amazing prescience with Brave New World, check out my January 9th episode titled Apple iPhones Give Me the Feelies. All right, regardless of how history judges Julian for his possibly extreme beliefs, I just want to share the impact that his book had on me when I first read it in 1989. I had just finished my first book on evolution, Ever Since Darwin, by the late, great Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard. And I felt lucky to have found Huxley's Knowledge, Morality, and Destiny in a used bookstore in Chicago. It had been reissued in 1960 with this new title after the first edition, New Bottles for New Wine, may not quite have attracted the thinking person's interest. Within just the first few pages of Huxley's book, I had an epiphany, actually two of them, that transcended any other religious, philosophical, or cosmological ideas I had had about the universe, human life, and our destiny. At 25 years old, my double epiphany was this. Through human evolution, the universe had become conscious of itself. And now, evolution could become conscious and intentional. Now, that may not sound that dramatic today, if you have a good science education. But at the time, my world of knowledge was just beginning to explode with new ideas about science. All right, fast forward another 25 years, and now we're discussing such radical ideas of conscious evolution with Elon Musk of Tesla and Yuval Noah Harari, the historian who wrote the 2017 book Homo Deus, about a future where some humans with biological and technological enhancements will rule over the commoners who cannot afford such luxuries. I covered this general topic in my May 2017 episode, What to Do Before the Machines Take Over. And I discussed the potential of CRISPR gene editing in such an unpredictable future in a week of back-to-back episodes in November 2017. One was titled, Don't Fight the Gravity of Exponential Change, and the other episode was Bitcoin or CRISPR, which is the bigger disruptor? More importantly, you can find some recent work I've done on CRISPR. Just this week, June 18th and June 20th, I made two videos on CRISPR because so much is happening with the science and the public companies that I own that there's just a lot to talk about. There's controversy. There's patent disputes. There was an article on June 11th citing two research studies that seem to have identified new dangers of CRISPR gene editing technology. So there's just a lot to learn and a lot to talk about. And because I'm an investor in those companies, I talk about them, but I don't say that everybody should rush out and buy these stocks because there's definitely, they have their own unique risks like any new science or biotechnology stocks. And so what I do is I try and, lay out, here's the stuff you should know. Here's how I look at investing in them. And, here are the risks. So, gene editing is going to be a big part of our future. And so whether or not you're an investor, it's definitely something you want to learn about. So if you go to Zacks.com and just put in one of the stock symbols for one of the CRISPR gene editing companies, like CRISPR Therapeutics, the symbol is CRSP. If you just put that in a quote search box, then you'll see a list of articles, and you should find two of mine about that. Okay, let's get back at our time machine, and we return to the early 1990s when I was reading 10 books at once from every field, trying to figure out a bunch of burning questions I had about the birth of the universe, the evolution of life, the probability of God, the spiritual calling of ecology, and the role of philosophy and religion in a world that seemed to be run on economic and technological priorities. It was a very confusing time for me. I left college and accelerated my self-driven quest just on my own. I became something of a radical left-wing tree hugger, thinking we should all go back to living in small farming communities to preserve the planet and raise kids in a better, more family-centered world. But then I had my next important epiphany. Because as confused as I was in my mid-20s, the one thing I didn't do was give up trying to figure it out. I spent entire days in my local library several days a month, from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. till they kicked me out, just searching for books and ideas and answers and somebody who could explain it to me. And my epiphany was this. This is like 1992. It was not only pointless and ridiculous to fight against technological progress, it was anti-human to do so. Because the one thing we were destined to do for certain was to tinker, to create, to innovate. Technology was what it meant to be human, I finally realized. And we, as humans, were going to keep right on exploring, inventing, and creating as long as we existed. It was our destiny. This philosophical and practical mind shift also shifted my politics back to the right in terms of economic liberty and self-determination. If a man or woman was free to create and build a company with ideas and hard work, then he or she should have as few restrictions as possible in creating that enterprise, making discoveries, and inventing a new world. I'm glad I woke up to these truths before the great bull market of the 1990s, which was built on such freedom and ingenuity. Indeed, our greatest entrepreneurs, from Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos to today's heroes like Elon Musk and Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, have shown us that their ideas have more economic power and creative destruction in them than any government policy or restriction. So since it was piles of books on unrelated topics that got me through my jungle of confusion, I came up with a special name for my style of learning. I called it Chaos Theory of Learning, Creativity, and Growth. It has served me ever since in learning new things. I used to keep a list of the half-dozen most important books that woke me up out of my misguided Luddite stupor. In a moment, I'll try to recall more than the 3 I can think of right now. First, let's flash forward again to 2018 and the newest book by Bill Nye, the Science Guy. It's titled Everything All at Once. And as you can imagine, it spoke to me at once. His subtitle is How to Unleash Your Inner Nerd, Tap into Radical Curiosity, and Solve Any Problem. I think the book would be great reading for middle school and high school teachers. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of a preview of it here because it's kind of fun. You know, he's a funny guy and he's definitely loves science and he loves talking about it. So here's his, on one page before the book starts, he's got this Bill's Guide to Doing Everything All at Once. Objective, change the world. Everyone you'll ever meet knows something you don't. Good engineering invites right use. Constraints provide opportunities. And this is obviously just a laundry list of his most important themes or values. Be part of the start. Think cosmically, act locally. Question before you believe. Change your mind when you need to. And finally, be optimistic, be responsible, be persistent. And I just want to read the first couple of paragraphs here. This is a book about everything. It is about everything I know and about everything I think you should know too. I realize that may sound a little crazy, but I'm completely serious. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information. When you pick up your phone or open your laptop and go online, you are instantly connected to a trillion bytes of data. That's a 1 followed by 24 zeros. Every year, another billion trillion bytes of data move around the internet, carrying everything from those important videos with kitty cats to the arcane but fantastic detailed results of subatomic particle collisions at the Large Hadron Collider. In that sense, talking about everything is easy. Everything you and I know and everything we need to know is already out there for the taking. Yet despite all those whizzing ones and zeros, the collective intelligence of billions of human brains, I still feel that we seem to be awfully Well, stupid. We're not using all this shared wisdom to solve big problems. We're not facing up to climate change. We haven't figured out how to make clean, renewable, reliable energy available to everyone. Too many people die in avoidable auto accidents, succumb to curable diseases, do not get enough food and clean water, and still do not have access to the internet's great, busy beehive mind. Despite being more connected than ever before, we're not particularly generous toward or understanding of one another, preferring to hide behind denial and personal bias. The flood of information has effectively allowed us to know something about everything, but that knowing is clearly not enough. We need to be able to sort the facts and put our knowledge into action, and that is why I wrote this book. So, definitely one to pick up, especially if you're involved with education. All right. Okay, so how about the books that opened my mind a little wider in 1992? I'm just going to list them here. There was one called Green Machines by Nigel Calder. And I don't remember if Nigel Calder is or was a biologist, but the book just blew me away because it was about, the coming genetic engineering of how we would be able to engineer plants and lots of other things eventually, animals, maybe humans. And what I realized by reading that book was, man, I can't stop this. This is happening. This is, there are scientists out there putting together pieces of this puzzle, and maybe, our worst fear is that there are diabolical scientists, right, with the intent to harm with something. But really, that's not how science works collectively. You've got thousands of little experiments going on in very distinct, discrete parts of biology and chemistry, and you put them to, they get put together and create new technologies or new products, and it's an unstoppable wave. That's what I realized. That was my epiphany, that technology was unstoppable. Another book I read, sort of a way back throwback, would be the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. I'd never read it, and I found it just incredibly enlightening and uplifting. Because I was also in a period where I was studying American history. Read about the Constitution, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and so those things gave me a new appreciation of liberty and what our country was founded on. A third book was The Pursuit of Virtue and Other Tory Notions by George Will. Along the same lines, George Will, fantastic historian and chronicler of America and the American experiment and how its roots in England, and that book is still, I think, timeless reading. And back to science, a fourth book that really opened my mind was Infinite in All Directions by Freeman Dyson. Freeman Dyson is a physicist, and in that, he, from a physicist's point of view, he talked about the world's problems and proposed solutions. Now, some of his solutions were, are pretty fantastic, like, hey, we need to colonize the universe because there's no way that we can continue living on this planet. And that may be true. But it opened my eyes to, somebody is thinking out decades or centuries and looking for solutions. And this is the conversation of science that gets passed on from a Freeman Dyson to today's astrophysicists or engineers or problem solvers. All right, so and we're gonna spin off of Freeman Dyson, the physicist, and talk about another physicist in a moment. First, I want to read a quote from Bertrand Russell, which sort of ties into the meta theme of today's discussion. One of the painful things about our time is that those who feel certainty are stupid, and those with any imagination and understanding are filled with doubt and indecision. Now, Bertrand Russell was a philosopher who lived. I can't remember when he died, but I mean he was doing a lot of writing around the turn of the 20th century, so 100 years ago. And he's some things just never change, right? So he's talking about one of the painful things about our time, and that was 100 years ago. So I thought that was an important quote for today's theme. Now let's talk about another physicist that you want to read and learn about, and I'm going to help you do that. And that would be Richard Feynman. I have a new book about Richard Feynman. First, let me read this quote by him. I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and different degrees of certainty about different things, but I'm not absolutely sure of anything. And that is the epitome of the scientific mind right there. You're never sure about anything. You have probabilities, approximate answers, possible beliefs, different degrees of certainty about different things, but no absolute certainty. All right, the book about Feynman is called The Quantum Labyrinth, How Richard Feynman and John Wheeler Revolutionized Time and Reality by Paul Halpern. And Paul is a professor of physics at the University of Sciences in Philadelphia and the author of 15 popular science books. So the guy's obviously, he's got the credentials. He's a physicist or he's a professor of physics, and he loves to write popular science books. And he must have done his homework on Feynman and Wheeler because he really, tells a sort of a dual biography here about their relationship, their friendship, and how important their work was, bridging off of what Einstein gave them a running start with, and they revolutionized further our ideas about time and reality. I'm not going to read anything from this book as much as I'd like to. I've taken snapshots with my phone of some pages and passages I liked, and I posted them on Twitter. But what I will direct your attention to is a fun resource you can start using immediately today, and that is the Twitter account at Prof. Feynman. So at Prof. Feynman, Feynman. Professor Feynman is no longer with us, but somebody uses that Twitter account to post just fantastic quotes and photographs and of him, and just really cool things. It's almost like you're having a conversation with Professor Feynman, and you hear more of these things about what it means, to have a scientific mind, to be a responsible, intelligent human on planet Earth and in these days, and what our job is with new knowledge. So definitely check that out on Twitter. When we come back, I've got some new information for you on why we pretend to know things, explained by a cognitive scientist. All right, I'll be back faster than you can spell cognitive neuroscience. Why we pretend to know things, explained by a cognitive scientist. This was an article written by Sean Illing and published on Vox. It was just updated June 15th. I think he originally wrote it in March. And let me just read the opening here. Why do people pretend to know things? Why does confidence so often scale with ignorance? Steve Sloman, a professor of cognitive science at Brown University, has some compelling answers to these questions. We're biased to preserve our sense of rightness, he told me, and we have to be. The author of The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone, Sloman's research focuses on judgment, decision-making, and reasoning. He's especially interested in what's called the illusion of explanatory depth. This is how cognitive scientists refer to our tendency to overestimate our understanding of how the world works. We do this, Sloman says, because of our reliance on other minds. The decisions we make, the attitudes we form, the judgments we make, depend very much on what other people are thinking, he said. If the people around us are wrong about something, there's a good chance we will be too. Proximity to truth compounds in the same way. In this interview, Sloman and I talk about the problem of unjustified belief. I ask him about the political implications of his research, and if he thinks the rise of fake news and alternative facts has amplified our cognitive biases. And so I encourage you to look up this article on Vox. I would just do a Google search, Why We Pretend to Know Things. Again, the author's name is Sean Illing. And so you've heard me talk about these things before. I mean, that's kind of the whole premise of the Mind Over Money podcast and my interest in behavioral economics is that, what people think they know just ain't so most of the time. And that has a real impact in trading and investing, where if you don't understand how your mind operates on risk, you will tend to make your money go away from you. And I always talk about my two favorite sciences. Neuroscience studies our behavior from the inside out, and the behavioral researchers study us from the outside in. But what both of them conclude with different types of science is that certainty is way overrated, and it gets us in trouble. And we see it all the time in investing. I certainly do anyway. So I teach investors and traders how to use their brains to make money, grow money, and not lose money. The problem is that we're just naturally biased and blind to our own behaviors and beliefs. So definitely look up that article and and then let me know what you think. I'm trying to think. I think my very first podcast, my first or second one in November of 2017 or 2016 rather. I kind of did the big coverage ground. I went over a list of behavioral biases and tried to lay the groundwork for what would be my favorite topics on the podcast. And since then I've brought in a lot of books on behavioral economics to sort of prove the fact that we're naturally irrational when it comes to things that we think we've got complete control over. All right, so in the big picture here, what I'm trying to wrap up with this, I made my title today, Knowledge, Certainty, and Destiny, borrowing from Julian Huxley, whose book was titled Knowledge, Morality, and Destiny, because these things are important. The change is accelerating so fast. I say the future is coming at us fast because science is just like hurtling us into a future that we're almost unprepared for because there's so much to know. I'll give you an example of something I encounter once in a while where people have access to science information and new knowledge, but they'll even tend to misuse it because of their, our natural bias, why we pretend to know things. Here's the wrong way to use science. Cherry pick research to confirm what you already believe and what your biases are. And I have people, somebody will say to me, yeah, but the neuroscientists are saying this now, that the teenage brain is still evolving and we're not, our brains are not fully mature until we're 25 years old or something. Somebody will tell me something like that. And I go, well, yeah, but it's a little more complicated than that. So the thing about using science is, use it to learn more, right? And never be certain of anything because there's so much to know anyway. I mean, you're building like this elaborate tapestry of knowledge when you go into anything, especially, if you're not a PhD in the life sciences, then to talk about neuroscience, I mean, we're relying on the work of thousands of other people who've done, lab experiments and research. And so to piece it all together and think that we can oversimplify how the brain works, I think it gets us in trouble. And really it's an incredible opportunity to learn, what we are, how we function, how we react to new information, and it may help us solve some of our most pressing problems. So remember that rule about science. Don't use it the wrong way. All right, and whenever I talk about people misusing knowledge and math and that sort of thing in markets, I always talk about the book The Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. His last name is spelled Taleb. And the Black Swan was about how we were handed this mathematical tool by people like Gauss, the bell curve, the normal distribution, and then it was applied to financial math. And the problem with it is that the bell curve is really good, and the normal distribution, the standard deviation is really good at measuring the variations in somewhat predictable things like physical phenomena, or data across a big population. But when it comes to markets and stocks, where human actions can be wildly unpredictable, the idea of an average or standard deviation in markets is basically absurd. So, I've never spoken to a scientist about their view of Taleb's book, because Taleb is more of a mathematician, philosopher, and trader, and obviously having standard deviation to analyze and put a framework on data in any kind of physical science is important. I wonder if scientists come across their own limitations with those tools in new areas of science or data. All right, I should probably wrap this podcast up pretty soon because it's my Chautauqua is going on pretty long. I know one of the things I wanted to wrap up with was cool things happening in education. Now, if you have kids in grade school or high school now, or they've been out in the past decade, I'm sure, you're familiar with Google Classroom. Google has done just an amazing job of embedding themselves in public schools by providing tools that teachers can use, and then giving kids their first email account, and then letting them use spreadsheets and documents and sharing presentations, and I forget what Google calls their PowerPoint version, but Google Slides, that's what they call it. So, but Google's doing other things too that enhance a teacher's abilities with students in putting new information and lessons in front of them, and making things interactive, and being able to share stuff instantly. So again, Google's already embedded themselves in schools, and you thought, well, Microsoft is trying to stay in there by giving Office free to schools, but Microsoft just made a big move this week. They bought a company called Flipgrid, which I guess, and I don't know that much about Flipgrid, but I guess it's a cool tool for teachers and students to be able to share work via video. So I think that was a great move by Microsoft to at least maintain any beachhead they have in schools, because you think about it. If they get to kids early with tools, right, mind tools, learning tools, then those are the tools that if you learn to use them at 10, you're probably going to be using them when you're 20 and 30 too. So I just wanted to mention that. All right, so this podcast, I don't know where you're listening. You could be on iTunes or Spotify or something. That's great. Leave comments, give me thumbs up, pass it on, share it with people. And there will be an article version on the Zacks website. So if you go to, if you can find a link to Zacks, to my podcast archive, or the actual article that goes along with this podcast, you'll get links to videos I've done, like on the CRISPR stocks, and then links to individual episodes that I've mentioned, whether it's on Elon Musk or Harari's book Homo Deus, or stuff with Apple or gene editing. Obviously, I immerse myself in science because it's coming at us so fast, and I want to see if I can even keep up. I envy the kids who are learning this stuff, while they're in grade school or middle school, because they're the ones that they're going to be creating our future. They're going to be, science is going to get passed on to them, and then what are they going to do with it? All right. I think, one of the last company I wanted to mention was Facebook, because in that article somebody mentioned fake news. Facebook created this ecosystem for people to share stuff, and then it got corrupted and taken advantage of, and now Facebook is having to do a huge cleanup operation. I see their signs in Chicago here, how to avoid fake news, and they're trying to sort of have people be able to connect more with each other, their friends and so forth, rather than whatever message somebody else is trying to put in front of them. And, so that's the reason I bring it up is because it's a great social experiment. And what I mean is the experiment already happened, but it was done to us. And it wasn't done really intentionally by some diabolical mind. It just sort of happened, but it's what's going to continue to happen with technology, right? When I did my podcast on Apple iPhones give me the feelies, it was about Apple realizing that there was a problem with kids becoming addicted to smartphones. Well, it makes sense. I mean, because our brains are predisposed to be captivated by bright lights and fast-moving images and apparent social connection. And with Facebook and fake news, that's just a case of, we're still human, and we are very susceptible to belief and wanting to share beliefs with others. People get one of my fascinations to study is crowd behavior, because people act differently in a crowd than they do by themselves or with their families. And the reason is because people sometimes get caught up in, oh man, I'm part of this movement, or I'm part of something bigger than myself. And people do sometimes really stupid things in crowds. We've seen it whether it's European soccer matches or riots in the streets in a U.S. urban situation. So, the same thing happens with people collectively on social media, where they think they're part of something, and so we see it on Twitter every day. So it's all about human nature hasn't changed much, but the technology is changing so fast. We're going to keep getting new experiments and new tests that will expose our weaknesses, and so consider this a topic we'll revisit. This idea of knowledge, certainty, and destiny. All right, thanks for joining me on the Mind Over Money podcast, and we'll talk to you soon.